I suppose every story like this starts with a man who thought he had it all figured out. My name's Tom, and I've been married to Emily for 15 years. We've got 2 kids, Jamie and Sophie, who are everything to me. I'd always thought of us as a normal, happy family. Sure, we had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I never imagined it would lead to this. We met in college, where I was studying engineering and she was majoring in psychology. Emily had this magnetic energy about her, a blend of intelligence and humor that pulled me in from day one. We dated for 3 years before I proposed, and she said yes with tears in her eyes. It was the happiest day of my life, and for a long time, I thought I'd won the lottery with her. Life after marriage wasn't much different from before. We were still madly in love, still spent our weekends exploring new places, and still couldn't keep our hands off each other. Then came Jamie, our firstborn, and everything shifted. He was our little miracle, and when Sophie followed 2 years later, our family felt complete. Emily decided to stay home with the kids, which made sense given how much she adored them. I worked hard to provide for us, taking on extra projects at work, but I never minded. It was all for them. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the signs earlier. Emily started to change slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. She became more distant, more preoccupied with things outside our family. I chalked it up to the stress of raising 2 young kids. Whenever I brought it up, she'd brush it off, saying she was just tired or needed some time to herself. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We'd been through so much together. We had trust. Things started getting really strange about a year ago. She began going out more often, meeting up with friends I'd never heard of, and her phone was suddenly off limits. When I asked about it, she'd laugh it off, saying I was being paranoid. Just friends from the gym, Tom, she'd say. I wanted to believe her. After all, trust was the foundation of our marriage, right? But the more I tried to convince myself, the more uneasy I felt. I remember the first time I felt a knot of doubt so tight that it made me physically sick. It was a Sunday evening, and Emily had gone out to meet a friend for coffee. She didn't come back until after midnight, reeking of alcohol, with a story that made little sense. She claimed they'd lost track of time, but something in her voice was off, like she was trying too hard to sound casual. I let it slide, told myself I was being overprotective. She's my wife, I told myself, she wouldn't do anything to hurt me. Then there was the night I found her texting late, well past midnight. I pretended to be asleep as she crept out of bed and into the bathroom with her phone. She was gone for almost an hour, and when she finally returned, she was crying. I asked her what was wrong, and she gave me some vague excuse about being stressed. I didn't press her. I should have, but I didn't. Our sex life started to suffer around that time too. Emily became increasingly distant, her passion replaced with a mechanical routine. We went from being a couple who couldn't keep our hands off each other to barely touching at all. When I brought it up, she'd sigh and say she was tired, or that it wasn't about me, it was just life catching up with her. Again, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. The turning point came a few weeks ago when my brother, Jake, moved back to town. Jake and I have always been close, though our lives took different paths. He's the fun one, the one everyone loves to be around. He's charming, outgoing, and has a way with people that I've always envied. When he announced he was coming back to start a new job, I was thrilled. Finally, I'd have my brother nearby again, someone to talk to grab a beer with after a long week. Emily seemed excited about Jake's return too, maybe even more than I expected. She started talking about him a lot, asking when he'd be over, what his plans were, and even going out of her way to clean up the house whenever he was coming around. I thought it was sweet. She was just trying to make him feel welcome, right? But then there were the little things that didn't add up. Like how Emily would suddenly have to run out to the store whenever Jake was over, or how they'd laugh at inside jokes I wasn't in on. And then there was that night, the night everything changed. Jake had come over for dinner, and we were all having a good time. The kids went to bed, and the 3 of us stayed up, drinking and reminiscing about old times. At some point, I must have dozed off on the couch. When I woke up, the house was quiet, too quiet. I noticed Emily wasn't beside me, and Jake's car was still in the driveway. My heart started pounding as I got up and looked around the house. They weren't in the kitchen, not in the living room, not in the backyard. Panic set in as I crept upstairs, my heart thundering in my chest. I reached our bedroom door and heard voices, hushed, urgent whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew something was very wrong. As I pushed the door open, my world shattered. I can still hear the creak of the door as it swung open, echoing in the silence like a gunshot. What I saw in that moment is burned into my memory, a scene I'll never forget no matter how much I wish I could. There they were, my wife and my brother, scrambling away from each other like two teenagers caught doing something forbidden. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching the sheets to her chest, while Jake stood by the window, shirtless, with a look of pure panic on his face. For a moment, the three of us just stared at each other, frozen in time. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, the blood draining from my face as the reality of what I was seeing sunk in. My wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for 15 years, was sitting in our bed, half naked, with my brother. My brother. The one person I never thought would betray me. Tom, Emily's voice was a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like? The absurdity of her words hit me like a slap to the face. How could she possibly explain away what I was seeing? There was no misunderstanding here, no room for doubt. They'd been caught red-handed, and now they were trying to lie their way out of it. Jake finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands up like he was trying to calm a wild animal. Tom, just listen, okay? Let us explain. But I wasn't in the mood to listen. My blood was boiling, and all I could think about was the sheer audacity of the two people I trusted most in the world betraying me in such a despicable way. Explain? You want to explain this? I spat, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. What the hell is there to explain? Emily started to cry, big, heaving sobs that made me sick to my stomach. Tom, I'm so sorry, she wailed, reaching out to me. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. I backed away from her touch, disgusted. A mistake? Is that what you call it? How long has this been going on, Emily? How long have you been fucking my brother behind my back? Jake flinched at my words, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. The guilt was written all over his face. Tom, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen. We never meant to hurt you. Never meant to hurt me? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. You've been sneaking around with my wife, and you think that's something you can just apologize for? Emily was sobbing uncontrollably now, her face buried in her hands. I never wanted this, Tom. I love you, I really do. I don't know what came over me, I was lonely, and Jake was there, and... Don't you dare blame this on loneliness. I roared, my anger exploding like a volcano. You had a choice, Emily. You both did. And you chose to betray me in the worst possible way. I wanted to punch something, anything, just to release the rage that was consuming me. I turned to Jake, who was still standing there like a guilty child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And you're my brother, Jake. My own flesh and blood. How could you do this to me? Jake couldn't look me in the eye. He hung his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, Tom. I don't have any excuse. I fucked up. I fucked up bad. That was the understatement of the century. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with betrayal and deceit. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I had to get out of there before I did something I'd regret. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my feet moving on autopilot as I headed for the door. I could hear Emily calling after me, her voice desperate, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys from the table in the hallway and walked out the front door, slamming it behind me with a force that shook the house. The night air was cool against my skin, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside me. I got into my car and drove, not knowing where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I had to get away from the lies, the betrayal, the overwhelming pain that threatened to consume me. I ended up in a parking lot by the lake, the same place I used to go when I needed to think. It was quiet, the water reflecting the moonlight in a way that used to bring me peace. But there was no peace to be found tonight. I sat there in the darkness, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had it come to this? How had the woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with, ended up in bed with my own brother? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more painful than the last. I thought about all the times I'd defended her, all the times I'd trusted her without question. And all along, she'd been lying to me, deceiving me in the worst possible way. I don't know how long I sat there, staring out at the water, my mind replaying the scene in the bedroom over and over again. Eventually, the anger began to give way to something else, something darker and more dangerous. I started to think about all the ways I could make them pay, about how I could hurt them as much as they'd hurt me. I wanted revenge. I needed revenge. And as I sat there in the dark, a plan began to form in my mind. But that's for another time. Right now, I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. Because one thing is for sure, nothing will ever be the same again. I didn't go home that night. I drove around for hours, aimlessly circling the city, trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, the betrayal followed me like a shadow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, Emily and Jake, laughing at me, mocking me. By the time the sun started to rise, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go back and face the wreckage of my life. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was eerily quiet. The kids were still asleep, thank God. I didn't want them to hear what was about to go down. I walked through the front door, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. I found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes puffy and red from crying. Jake was nowhere to be seen. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "Tom. I'm so sorry. Please, can we just talk about this?" I ignored her, walking past her to the coffee pot. I needed something to ground me, something to stop the shaking in my hands. As I poured myself a cup, I felt her eyes on me, waiting, dreading what I might say. When I finally spoke, my voice was cold, distant, like I was talking to a stranger. "Where's Jake?" She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. He left. He said he needed some time to think." I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. "Time to think? That's rich. What the hell is there to think about? You two made your choices. Now it's time to deal with the consequences." Emily flinched at my words, her eyes filling with tears again. "Tom, please. I know I've hurt you, but we can get through this. We can fix this." I turned to face her, my expression hardening. "Fix this? How do you propose we fix this, Emily? You think we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened? You think I can just forget that you fucked my brother?" She recoiled at the venom in my voice, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. All I wanted was to make her feel a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. "Tell me, Emily," I continued, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been sneaking around with Jake behind my back?" She looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. It started a few months ago. It wasn't supposed to happen, Tom. I never meant for it to go this far." I slammed my fist on the table, making her jump. "A few months? You've been lying to me for months, and you expect me to believe it wasn't supposed to happen? Don't insult my intelligence, Emily." She started crying again, big, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. But I wasn't moved by her tears. Not anymore. Tom, I was lonely, she choked out between sobs. You were always so busy with work, with the kids. I felt like you didn't even see me anymore. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I snapped, my anger flaring up again. I was busy because I was trying to provide for this family. Because I thought that's what you wanted, a stable, secure life for us and the kids. But apparently, that wasn't enough for you, was it? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Tom, it wasn't like that. I love you. I never stopped loving you. But I felt so alone, and Jake, he was there for me. He listened to me. Yeah, I bet he did, I muttered bitterly. He was there for you in ways I never could be, right? You must have really enjoyed yourselves. Her face crumpled at my words, and for a moment, I thought she might fall apart right there in front of me. But then something shifted in her expression, a flicker of defiance breaking through the guilt. You're right, she said quietly, her voice steadying. I did make a choice. But so did you, Tom. You chose to ignore me, to put everything else ahead of our marriage. You left me alone, and I cut her off with a sharp gesture, not wanting to hear any more of her excuses. Don't you dare turn this around on me, Emily. I may have made mistakes, but I never betrayed you. I never broke our vows. You did that. You and Jake. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness, of hope. But she found none. I was done. Done with the lies, the deceit, the betrayal. What happens now, Tom? She asked finally, her voice small and trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rage still simmering inside me. I don't know, I admitted. But I do know this, we're done, Emily. You've destroyed any chance we had of saving this marriage. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could hold back the truth. No, Tom, please. Don't say that. We can go to counseling, we can. I shook my head, cutting her off. Counseling isn't going to fix this, Emily. You broke something that can't be repaired. And even if it could, I don't want to. I don't want to live with someone I can't trust, someone who's capable of doing what you did. She crumpled into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her tears. I went upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, I suppose, and started packing a bag. I couldn't stay in that house, not with her, not after what she'd done. I needed space, time to think, time to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. As I was packing, I heard a soft knock on the door. I turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her little face crumpled with worry. Daddy, what's wrong? Why is Mommy crying? My heart broke at the sight of her, and for a moment, I almost lost it. But I managed to keep it together, forcing a smile for her sake. It's okay, sweetie, I said, my voice cracking just a little. Mommy and Daddy just had a fight. But everything's going to be okay, I promise. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her eyes wide and scared. Are you leaving? She asked, her voice trembling. I crouched down to her level, taking her small hands in mine. Just for a little while, baby. I need to clear my head. But I'll be back, okay? And I'll see you and Jamie every day. I promise. She threw her arms around my neck, holding on tight, and I hugged her back, feeling the tears prick at my eyes. This wasn't her fault. She didn't deserve any of this. And yet, she was caught in the middle of the mess her mother and I had made. After a long moment, I pulled back, kissing her on the forehead. Go back to bed, sweetie. I'll see you in the morning. She nodded, her eyes still filled with tears, and I watched as she walked back to her room, her little shoulders slumped with the weight of what she didn't yet understand. When she was gone, I finished packing and headed back downstairs. Emily was still sitting at the table, staring blankly at the wall, her face streaked with tears. I didn't say anything to her as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. There was nothing left to say. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than staying in that house. All I knew was that I couldn't be there, not with her, not with the memories of what she'd done. I needed to get away, to put some distance between myself and the betrayal that was threatening to tear me apart. As I drove away, my mind started racing again, thoughts of revenge creeping in, darker and more twisted than before. Emily wasn't the only one who was going to pay for this. Jake had a debt to settle too, and I was going to make damn sure he paid it in full. But that would come later. First, I needed to figure out how to survive the next few hours, the next few days. Because one thing was certain, my life, as I knew it, was over. And I had no idea what was going to come next. After I left the house, I drove for hours, my mind in a fog of rage and disbelief. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily, how she had betrayed me, how she had shattered our life together. Every mile that passed under my tires only fueled the anger inside me, burning away any remnants of the love I once had for her. By the time I pulled into the motel parking lot on the edge of town, I was consumed by one thought: she had to pay. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the neon sign blinking "vacancy" through the windshield. My hands were shaking, my heart racing as the plan began to take shape in my mind. I knew I couldn't just walk away from this. I couldn't let her get away with what she'd done. She needed to understand the magnitude of her betrayal, to feel the pain she had inflicted on me. And I was going to make sure she did. I checked into the motel and threw my bag onto the bed, pacing the room like a caged animal. I kept thinking about how to strike back at Emily in a way that would make her suffer as much as I was suffering. Something that would cut her deep, just like she'd done to me. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I knew exactly how to hurt her, how to strip away everything she cared about and leave her broken. First, I needed to gather ammunition, information, secrets, anything that could destroy her from the inside out. I knew Emily well enough to know that she had skeletons in her closet, things she wouldn't want anyone to know. And I was going to dig them all up, expose every dark corner of her life. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through her social media, looking for anything that might give me an edge. Old friends, former coworkers, anyone who might know something useful. I sent a few messages, casually asking about Emily, pretending to be concerned about her. It was amazing how quickly people would spill their guts if they thought they were helping. Within hours, I had a few interesting leads, stories of flirtations she'd had before we got married, rumors about things she'd done in college, and a few old boyfriends who were more than happy to dish out dirt. But that wasn't enough. I needed something concrete, something that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about who she really was. That's when I remembered her journal. Emily had always been an avid writer, filling up notebook after notebook with her thoughts, her feelings, her deepest secrets. I'd never read any of them. I respected her privacy, but now I didn't care about privacy. I only cared about making her pay. I drove back to the house early the next morning, just as the sun was coming up. The kids would still be asleep, and Emily wouldn't expect me back so soon. I let myself in quietly, my heart pounding as I made my way to the bedroom. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I found the journals in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, tucked away beneath some old letters and photographs. There were several of them, bound in leather, the pages filled with her neat handwriting. I flipped through them quickly, scanning for anything that might be useful. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Page after page, Emily had poured out her thoughts, her desires, her regrets. And there, in black and white, was the proof of her betrayal. She wrote about how lonely she felt, how she longed for excitement, for passion, for something more than the life we had built together. She wrote about Jake, about how he made her feel alive, how she couldn't resist the pull of their connection. The words were like a knife to my heart, but they were exactly what I needed. I took pictures of the most damning entries with my phone, making sure I had all the evidence I needed. Then I put the journals back exactly where I found them and slipped out of the house as quietly as I had come. Back at the motel, I started putting the pieces together. I wrote out everything I knew, every dirty secret, every shameful detail of Emily's life. Then I began crafting the message that would bring her world crashing down. I wasn't going to confront her directly, that would be too easy. No, I wanted to watch her squirm, to see her try to wriggle out of the trap I was setting. And I knew just how to do it. I set up an anonymous email account and began drafting the messages. One for her parents, detailing her affair with Jake, complete with excerpts from her journal to back it up. Another for her closest friends, sharing the stories I'd gathered from her past, painting a picture of a woman who was far from the loving, devoted wife and mother she pretended to be. And a third one, for Jake's boss, hinting at the inappropriate relationship between him and Emily, suggesting that it might be affecting his performance at work. I sent the emails one by one, savoring the anticipation of what was to come. I imagined the look on Emily's face when she realized that her perfect little life was crumbling around her. The thought of her trying to explain herself, trying to repair the damage, filled me with a sick sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. There was more to come, more ways to make her suffer. The next step was the financials. Emily handled most of our finances, but I knew enough to cause some chaos. I started by moving some money around, shifting funds from our joint accounts into one under my name only. Nothing too drastic, just enough to make her life difficult when she tried to access it. Then I canceled a few of her credit cards, made sure her phone bill was overdue, and even put a stop on a couple of important payments that would bounce back in a few days. It was petty, I knew that, but it felt good to have some control, to be the one pulling the strings for once. The last part of my plan was the hardest. I needed to stay in control, to keep my emotions in check, no matter how much I wanted to scream at her, to throw her out of the house. Instead, I decided to play it cool, to pretend like everything was fine, like I was willing to work things out. I knew it would mess with her head, make her paranoid, make her wonder what I was planning. And that was exactly what I wanted. I waited a day before going back home, giving the emails time to do their work. When I walked through the door, Emily was waiting for me, looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Tom," she started, her voice shaky, "we need to talk." I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "About what?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "I got some messages. From my parents, from my friends. They know, Tom. They know about Jake and me." I feigned shock, doing my best to appear genuinely concerned. "What? How could they know?" "I don't know," she cried, her voice cracking. "But they do, and they're furious. My parents won't even talk to me, and my friends, they've all turned their backs on me." I sat down at the table, acting like I was trying to process the news. That's awful, Emily. I'm so sorry." Her hands shook as she reached out to me, desperate for some sign of comfort. "Tom, please, we have to figure this out. We have to make this right." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Make it right? How do you propose we do that, Emily? You've made a mess of things, and I don't see how you can fix it." She started crying again, her tears falling into her coffee cup as she pleaded with me. "Tom, please, I'll do anything. Just help me. I can't lose everything. I can't lose you." I let her cry, watching as the realization of what she'd done began to sink in. She was finally starting to understand the gravity of her actions, and it was tearing her apart. But I wasn't done with her yet. I had one more card to play, one more way to make her pay. "I'll help you," I said finally, my voice calm and measured. "But it's going to cost you." She looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "Anything, Tom. I'll do anything. First, you're going to cut off all contact with Jake. No more phone calls, no more visits, nothing. If I find out you've been talking to him, we're done." She nodded eagerly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Okay, I can do that." I swear, I won't talk to him again. Second, you're going to sign over full control of our finances to me. I'm going to handle the money from now on. You'll get an allowance, enough to cover your expenses, but that's it. She hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but she didn't have a choice. She knew it, and so did I. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And third, I continued, leaning in closer, you're going to do exactly what I say, when I say it, no questions asked. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. Your parents, your friends, everyone. Her eyes widened in fear, and she nodded quickly, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Okay, Tom. I'll do whatever you want. Just, please, don't tell anyone else. I smiled, a cold, triumphant smile that made her flinch. Good. Then we understand each other. I stood up and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her to sit there and stew in her misery. The game had only just begun, and I was going to enjoy every minute of it. Emily thought she could break me, but she was wrong. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. I was going to be the one in control, the one calling the shots. And she was going to learn that the hard way. The next few days were a blur of calculated cruelty. I made sure she knew exactly where she stood, giving her orders like she was a servant in her own home. I made her cook, clean, do all the things she used to ask me to help with, all while I watched from the sidelines, making sure she knew she was being punished. I took away her car keys, making her dependent on me for everything, and I made sure she was too afraid to step out of line. I never laid a hand on her, I didn't need to. The fear, the shame, the humiliation of knowing that I held her fate in my hands was punishment enough. And I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at me now, no longer with love, but with fear, with dread, with the realization that she had lost everything. And I relished it. Every moment of it. This was my revenge, and I was going to savor it for as long as I could. The satisfaction of watching Emily squirm under the weight of her own guilt was sweet, but it wasn't enough. There was still one more person who needed to be dealt with, Jake. My own brother, the man I trusted above all others, had stabbed me in the back. If I was going to find any peace, I needed to make sure he suffered too. Jake had always been the golden boy. Charming, good-looking, and effortlessly successful, he'd coasted through life with everything handed to him on a silver platter. I used to envy him, admire him even. But now, all I felt was contempt. He thought he could have it all, his brother's wife, his brother's life, and walk away unscathed. He was wrong. I started by digging into Jake's life, just like I had with Emily. I knew where he worked, where he hung out, who his friends were. I also knew his weaknesses, his pride, his vanity, his desperate need to be liked and admired. Those were the chinks in his armor, and I intended to exploit them. The first thing I did was send an anonymous tip to his boss. Jake worked for a large corporation, a place where image and reputation were everything. The tip hinted at inappropriate behavior, at conflicts of interest involving a female client, nothing too explicit, but enough to raise eyebrows and start rumors. I knew it would get back to him, that it would make his life difficult at work, force him to explain himself to people who would now be watching him closely. Next, I decided to hit him where it would really hurt, his social life. Jake thrived on his connections, on being the center of attention in his circle of friends. So, I started spreading rumors, little whispers about his affair with Emily, about how he betrayed his own brother. I made sure to mention how easily he'd moved on from one conquest to the next, how he couldn't be trusted, how he'd do the same to anyone else if it suited him. It didn't take long for those rumors to spread. People love gossip, especially when it involves scandal and betrayal. I could see the effects almost immediately. Jake started avoiding social events, his usual bravado replaced with an anxious, furtive demeanor. He looked over his shoulder constantly, as if expecting someone to confront him at any moment. His charm, his easygoing nature, started to crack under the pressure. He was unraveling, and it was glorious to watch. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to make sure Jake felt the full weight of what he'd done, so I decided to take things one step further. I knew he was dating someone, another woman who had no idea what kind of man she was involved with. I found her on social media, a pretty blonde named Lauren who seemed completely oblivious to the mess Jake had made of his life. I reached out to her anonymously, sending her screenshots of the messages between Jake and Emily, along with a detailed account of their affair. I made sure to highlight the worst parts, the parts that would hurt the most, the lies he'd told her, the way he'd used her, the fact that he was sleeping with his brother's wife while pretending to be committed to her. It didn't take long for Lauren to respond. She was devastated, furious, and ready to confront Jake. I made sure to keep myself out of it, letting her believe she'd discovered the truth on her own. When I saw the aftermath, I knew it had worked. She dumped him in a spectacularly public way, right in the middle of a crowded bar, shouting at him, slapping him, and making sure everyone knew exactly why she was leaving him. It was all over social media within hours, videos, pictures, and comments from people who had witnessed the scene. Jake was humiliated, his carefully crafted image shattered beyond repair. But there was one final piece of the puzzle, one last act of vengeance that would bring it all together. I'd been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment, and now it was time. I called Jake, asking him to meet me at our childhood home, the place where we'd grown up together, where we'd shared so many memories. It was the perfect setting for what I had planned. He agreed, though I could hear the hesitation in his voice. He knew something was up, but he couldn't refuse. Maybe he thought he could talk his way out of it, smooth things over like he always did. Or maybe he just didn't have the courage to face me head-on. Either way, he showed up, just like I knew he would. The house was empty when he arrived. Our parents were away on a trip, leaving us alone in the place where it had all begun. Jake walked in, looking nervous, uncertain. He called out my name, but I didn't answer right away. I wanted him to sweat, to feel the tension build until he couldn't take it anymore. When I finally stepped out of the shadows, I could see the relief on his face, relief that quickly turned to confusion when he saw the expression on mine. I wasn't there to forgive him, to make peace. I was there to finish what he'd started. "Tom," he began, his voice shaky. "I'm glad you called. We need to talk." I didn't say anything, just stared at him, letting the silence stretch on. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to fill the void with meaningless chatter. "Look, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we're brothers, man. We can get past this." I took a step closer, my eyes locked on his. "You think this is something we can just get past, Jake? You think you can fuck my wife and then come here and tell me we're still brothers?" He flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. "It was a mistake, Tom. I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't mean for it to happen." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice rising. "A mistake is spilling a drink, Jake. What you did, what you and Emily did, that wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to betray me." I know," he stammered, his eyes pleading with me. "But I'm sorry, Tom. I swear, I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make it right." "Anything?" I echoed, my tone mocking. "Anything to make it right?" He nodded desperately. "Yes, anything." I let the silence hang between us for a moment, savoring the fear in his eyes. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it up for him to see. "Do you know what this is, Jake?" He shook his head, confusion and fear mingling on his face. "No, what is it?" "This," I said, my voice cold and emotionless, "is everything. It's the emails I sent to your boss, to Lauren, to all your friends. It's the proof of your affair with Emily. It's the evidence that's going to ruin you." His face went pale as the realization hit him. "Tom, you can't do this. Please. You don't have to do this." I smiled, a slow, cruel smile that made him take a step back. "Oh, but I do. You see, Jake, you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed my life. And now, I'm going to destroy yours. He lunged at me, trying to grab the flash drive, but I was ready for him. I sidestepped his clumsy attack, pushing him away with a force that sent him stumbling back into the wall. He looked up at me, fear and desperation etched on his face. "Tom, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. I'll lose everything." "That's the idea," I said coldly. "You're going to lose everything, just like I did. And you're going to live with the consequences of your actions for the rest of your life." I watched as the last vestiges of his arrogance crumbled, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew there was no way out, no way to undo what had been done. He was trapped, just like I had been. "Get out," I said finally, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Get out of my sight, and don't ever come back. If I see you again, if I hear your name, I'll make sure this flash drive ends up in the hands of every person who matters in your life. And then, you'll really lose everything." He didn't argue, didn't try to reason with me. He just turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty house as he fled. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction, a dark pleasure in knowing that I'd broken him, just as he'd tried to break me. When he was gone, I looked down at the flash drive in my hand. It felt heavy, like it held the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. I could have destroyed it, erased the evidence, but I didn't. I slipped it back into my pocket, a reminder of the power I still held, the final piece of my revenge. As I left the house, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anger, the rage, the need for vengeance, they were all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But for now, they were quiet, content. I had done what I needed to do. I had made Jake suffer, just as he deserved. And that was enough. The high of revenge didn't last long. Once the adrenaline faded, I was left with a hollow emptiness that gnawed at me. I had hurt Emily and Jake, made them pay for what they did, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. The damage had been done, and no amount of retribution could change that. I was still left with a broken marriage and a family teetering on the edge of ruin. I spent the next few days avoiding home, crashing at a friend's place while I tried to figure out what to do next. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. Eventually, I'd have to face Emily, face the reality of our situation, and make the decisions that would shape our future, my future. So, one evening, I found myself driving back to the house, dreading the conversation that was inevitable but necessary. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving us the privacy we needed for what was about to come. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the light on in the living room, a familiar but now unsettling sight. Emily was sitting on the couch when I walked in, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could tell she knew this was it, the moment where everything would finally be laid bare. "Tom," she began, her voice hesitant, as if she was afraid of what I might say. "We need to talk." I nodded, taking a seat in the armchair across from her, keeping a distance between us that mirrored the emotional chasm that had formed over the past few weeks. "Yeah, we do." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. "I know I've hurt you, beyond anything I could ever make right. And I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we have to figure out what comes next. We can't keep living like this." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like forever. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of what she'd done had physically diminished her. There was no trace of the woman who had once captivated me, no sign of the confident, loving partner I had shared my life with. She was just broken. "I don't think there's anything left to figure out, Emily," I said quietly, the words heavy with finality. "We're done. This marriage, it's over." She flinched, as if I'd struck her, but she didn't argue. She knew it was true. We both did. "What about the kids?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to tell them?" That was the hardest part. The kids. They had no idea what was going on, no clue that their parents were on the brink of divorce. I had tried to shield them from the worst of it, but they weren't stupid. They knew something was wrong. "We'll tell them the truth," I said after a long pause. "That we tried to make it work, but we couldn't. And that we both love them, and that's never going to change." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "I don't want to lose them, Tom. I can't lose them." "You won't," I assured her, though the words felt hollow. "They'll stay with you. You're their mother, and they need you." She looked up at me, surprise flickering in her eyes. "What about you? Don't you want custody?" The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. I wanted to be there for my kids, to be a part of their lives, but I also knew that uprooting them, forcing them to split their time between two homes, would only make things harder for them. They needed stability, and as much as it pained me to admit it, that stability was with Emily. "I'll still see them," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll still be their father. But they should stay with you. It's what's best for them." She nodded slowly, wiping away the tears that were now streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for that." I didn't respond. There was nothing more to say on that front. We both knew it was the right decision, no matter how much it hurt. But there was still the matter of us, of how we were going to untangle the mess we'd made of our lives. "I'll move out," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I'll find a place nearby so I can still be close to the kids." She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. "Tom, you don't have to do that. We can figure something out. You don't have to leave." "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "I can't stay here, Emily. Not after everything that's happened. It's not healthy for any of us." She opened her mouth to argue, but then she seemed to think better of it. Instead, she just nodded, a defeated expression settling on her face. "Okay. If that's what you need to do." "It is." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of our decisions pressing down on us. This was the end of something that had once been beautiful, something that had once been the center of my world. But now, all that was left was ashes, and there was no point in trying to rebuild something that had been burned to the ground. "When do you think we should tell the kids?" Emily asked quietly, breaking the silence. "Soon," I replied. "But we need to figure out how we're going to do this. We need to make sure they understand that this isn't their fault, that we both love them and that's not going to change." She nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "They're good kids, Tom. They'll be okay. We'll make sure of that." "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "We will." I stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation settle heavily on my shoulders. "I'll start looking for a place tomorrow," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "I'll let you know when I've found something." She stood up too, taking a step toward me as if she wanted to reach out, to touch me, to hold on to what little remained of our connection. But she didn't. She stopped herself, her hands falling limply to her sides. "I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." I looked at her, at the woman I had loved for so many years, and felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I wanted to forgive her, to take her in my arms and tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. The trust was gone, the love tainted by betrayal, and there was no going back. "I know," I said quietly. "But sorry doesn't change anything." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I know." With nothing left to say, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in the dim light of the living room. The house felt like a stranger's now, a place that no longer held any warmth, any comfort. I was a ghost in the life I had built, a life that was now crumbling around me. As I climbed the stairs to what had once been our bedroom, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The bed we had shared, the pictures on the walls, the familiar smell of her perfume, all of it felt foreign, like it belonged to a different time, a different person. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that was tearing me apart. Anger, sadness, regret, and a deep, aching loneliness all vied for control, leaving me exhausted and numb. But there was no point in dwelling on it. The decision had been made, the path laid out before me. All that was left was to follow it, to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurt. I started packing my things, mechanically sorting through my belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. It was a small act, but it was something I could control, something that gave me a sense of purpose in the midst of the chaos. As I worked, I thought about the kids, about how this would change their lives forever. I thought about the promises I had made to them, about the family we had once been, and I felt a pang of guilt, of failure. I had let them down. We both had. But I also knew that staying in a broken marriage, forcing them to live in a house filled with resentment and anger, would do more harm than good. They needed to see that it was okay to walk away from something that wasn't working, to choose a different path when the one you're on leads to a dead end. By the time I finished packing, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the room. I stood there for a moment, looking at the packed bags, at the life I was leaving behind, and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This was the end, but it was also the beginning of something new. I carried my bags downstairs, setting them by the front door. Emily was still in the living room, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the TV that wasn't even on. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm going to stay at a hotel for a few days," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Just until I find a place." She nodded, not saying a word, her gaze falling back to the blank screen in front of her. I picked up my bags, pausing at the door to look back at her one last time. "We'll talk more tomorrow," I said, though I wasn't sure she even heard me. Without another word, I walked out of the house and into the cool night air, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me, suffocating me. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a small spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. The kids would stay with their mother, and I would be there for them as much as I could. But I knew I needed to start over, to rebuild my life piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and emotional exhaustion. Emily and I had agreed to keep things as civil as possible for the kids' sake, but that didn't make it any easier. Every time I saw her, it was like a fresh wound being torn open, a reminder of everything we had lost. But we both knew that we had to push through, that the kids needed stability now more than ever. We sat down with Jamie and Sophie one evening, breaking the news to them as gently as we could. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, watching their faces crumple as the reality of our words sank in. Sophie, being younger, didn't fully grasp the implications, but Jamie, he understood. He tried to be brave, but I could see the hurt in his eyes, the confusion and fear. "Are you and Mom not going to live together anymore?" Jamie asked, his voice small, trembling. Emily and I exchanged a glance before I answered. "No, buddy, we're not. But that doesn't mean we don't love you and your sister. We'll always be here for you, no matter what." "But why, Dad?" he pressed, his voice breaking. "Why can't you just stay together? How do you explain to an 11-year-old the complexities of adult relationships? How do you tell your son that his mother and uncle betrayed you, that your family has been torn apart by lies and deceit? You don't. You tell him what he needs to hear, what will help him sleep at night." "Sometimes, grown-ups have problems they can't fix," I said softly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But that doesn't change how much we love you. We'll still be a family, just in a different way." Sophie started crying, her little shoulders shaking as she clung to Emily. I don't want you to go, Daddy, she sobbed. I want us to be together. It took everything in me not to break down right there. I knelt beside her, pulling her into a hug, feeling her tiny hands clutching my shirt. I know, sweetheart, I whispered, my throat tight. But I'll see you all the time, okay? And we'll do lots of fun things together, just like we always do. She nodded, but her tears didn't stop, and neither did the guilt that gnawed at me for failing to protect them from this pain. Emily looked at me over Sophie's head, her eyes filled with the same guilt, the same regret. This wasn't what we had wanted for our children, but it was the reality we had to face. After the kids went to bed, the house felt emptier than ever. Emily and I sat in the kitchen, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. The weight of our decisions hung in the air, and there was no avoiding what came next. We should probably start the legal process, Emily said quietly, her voice devoid of the strength she once had. Get the paperwork in order, make sure everything's clear for the kids. Yeah, I agreed, though the thought of dragging everything through a courtroom made my stomach turn. But let's try to keep it as amicable as possible. We don't need to make this harder than it already is. She nodded, her eyes downcast. I'll talk to a lawyer tomorrow. We can work out the details and make sure it's fair. The conversation felt surreal, like we were talking about someone else's life. But this was our reality now, and there was no turning back. The life we had built together was over, and all that was left was to dismantle it piece by piece. Over the next few weeks, the legal process began. We divided our assets, worked out a custody arrangement that would keep the kids with Emily while giving me regular visitation. There were no fights, no bitter arguments. We both wanted to avoid putting the kids through any more pain than necessary. But that didn't make it any less painful for us. One afternoon, after signing another round of paperwork, I found myself sitting alone in the empty house that would soon no longer be mine. The echoes of our life together were everywhere, the photographs on the walls, the worn spots on the carpet where the kids had played, the marks on the doorframe where we had measured their growth over the years. Each memory was a reminder of what we had lost, of what could never be recovered. As I walked through the house, room by room, I felt a deep sadness settle over me, mingling with the anger and betrayal that had consumed me for so long. But there was something else there too, something quieter, more reflective. Acceptance, maybe. A realization that as much as I hated what had happened, as much as I wished I could turn back time and change it, I couldn't. All I could do was move forward, one step at a time. I ended up in the kids' room, standing in the doorway, looking at the bunk beds where Jamie and Sophie slept. I could picture them there, their faces peaceful in sleep, unaware of the storm that had been raging around them. I had to remind myself that they were strong, that they would get through this. And so would I. Emily and I had one last conversation before I moved out. It was late at night, after the kids were asleep, and we sat in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of our life together. We didn't say much at first, just sat in silence, listening to the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft and filled with the weight of everything we'd been through. I don't know how we got here, Tom. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't respond right away. I had heard those words so many times, and they had lost their meaning. But I knew she was sincere, that she was struggling with the consequences of her actions just as much as I was. I know, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. But here we are. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could fix what I've broken. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of the love I used to have for her. It was buried under layers of hurt and betrayal, but it was still there, a reminder of the life we had once shared. But it wasn't enough to change the reality we were facing. I wish you could too, I said softly. But some things can't be fixed, Emily. Sometimes, you just have to let go. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, trying to hold herself together. I know, she whispered. But it's so hard, Tom. It's so hard to let go. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Letting go was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. But it was the only way forward, for both of us. I don't hate you, I said after a long silence, surprising myself with the realization. I'm angry, and I'm hurt, but I don't hate you, Emily. I don't think I ever could. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and relief. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Tom. But thank you for saying that. It's not about forgiveness, I replied, my voice steady. It's about moving on. We both need to move on, for the kids, for ourselves. Holding on to the anger, the bitterness, it's not going to help anyone. She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're a good man, Tom. Better than I deserve. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, the silence between us filled with the unspoken understanding that this was the end. There would be no more fighting, no more accusations. Just the quiet acceptance that our time together was over. The next morning, I packed the last of my things and loaded them into the car. Emily stood in the doorway, watching me with a look that was a mixture of sorrow and resignation. The kids were still asleep, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to make the goodbye any harder than it already was. I walked up to Emily, standing there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, I just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. She nodded back, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I got into the car and drove away, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I knew I had to keep moving forward, to find a new path, a new life for myself and for my kids. As I drove, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The anger, the rage, the need for revenge, they had all burned themselves out, leaving behind a quiet resolve. I had survived the worst of it, and now it was time to rebuild, to find a way to be happy again. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when the pain would feel overwhelming. But I knew, deep down, that I could do it. I had to, for Jamie, for Sophie, and for myself. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I had been through hell, but I had come out the other side. And I was ready to start again.